The diner is buzzing with the usual morning rush, coffee cups clinking, orders being shouted, and plates stacked high. But in the midst of it all, something doesn't seem right. A waiter, struggling with a hand wrapped in bandages, moves through the chaos. His stiff movements betray the pain he's enduring, yet he pushes through, trying to maintain his usual pace. What's more shocking than his injury is the cruel treatment he's receiving from his manager, Ross. Every mistake, no matter how small, is met with harsh, demeaning words. The customers notice, whispering among themselves, some offering sympathy, others shaking their heads. But what no one sees is the deeper truth that Harold, an undercover owner, is quietly witnessing. He's been watching, observing the way the manager treats the waiter, and he knows something isn't adding up. What appears to be a simple case of workplace tension is about to unravel into something much darker. Harold is about to uncover a hidden truth that will shake everything to its core. If this is your first time here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more powerful stories like this one. Drop a like, share with friends, and leave a comment. We love hearing your thoughts. Your support helps us keep bringing you stories that matter. The morning rush was in full swing, the buzz of conversation and the clinking of cups filling the air. In the center of the chaos stood the waiter, his movements stiff and slow. He worked through the pain, but it was clear something was wrong. His left hand, wrapped in thick bandages, barely moved as he carried trays with his right. Every step was a challenge. A few customers noticed, but most were too wrapped up in their own breakfasts to pay attention. The ones who did glanced over, their eyes filled with sympathy. They whispered amongst themselves. "Poor guy, he shouldn't even be here today," one customer muttered to his companion, his voice barely above a whisper. Another chimed in. "Yeah, he's in obvious pain and that manager doesn't seem to care." The manager, Ross, leaned against the counter, barking orders. His voice was sharp, and it cut through the air like a blade. "Pick up the pace! People are waiting!" He didn't seem to notice the pain the waiter was in. Each time the waiter made a mistake, no matter how small, Ross was there, ready to pounce. A spilled drink? "Get it together, you're useless!" A late order? "Why can't you keep up? You're slowing everyone down." The customers could hear it too. They exchanged uncomfortable glances, some shaking their heads, others fidgeting in their seats. No one spoke up, but the tension was palpable. They saw what was happening but did nothing. Denise, despite the pain in his hand, continued to move as quickly as possible. His good hand ached from carrying so many trays, but quitting wasn't an option. Bills needed to be paid. Rent didn't care about injuries. He smiled as he passed tables, greeting customers with a soft, "Enjoy your meal." But it was clear that the smile was a mask. His eyes betrayed the exhaustion, the weariness that was taking a toll on him. Every time he flinched in pain, he fought to hide it. But Ross wasn't fooled. He saw the weakness, and he exploited it. "You're lucky to have a job," Ross would say with a sneer. "Don't think you're irreplaceable." Customers watched in silence. Some whispered, some stared openly, and a few exchanged knowing glances. They all saw the same thing, a man struggling, doing his best, but being torn down by someone in power. But Harold, an older man sitting at the corner booth, noticed something that others didn't. He'd been coming to this diner for months, and he had seen how hard the waiter worked. Today, however, something was off. Harold watched the waiter carefully. His eyes moved from the way his hand trembled to the way he avoided looking at Ross. Something about this situation didn't add up, and Harold couldn't shake the feeling that there was more beneath the surface. Ross continued to belittle the waiter, and Harold felt a growing sense of discomfort. He had been around enough to recognize cruelty when he saw it. It wasn't just about the spilled drink or the mistakes. It was about control. Harold wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but something didn't sit right with him. As he stirred his coffee, he observed the waiter's every move. He noticed how he avoided eye contact with Ross, how he flinched when the manager got too close. Later in the day, after the rush died down, Harold asked for the manager. Ross approached, ready to brush off any customer complaints, but Harold wasn't interested in the food. He had other questions. "What's going on with that waiter?" Harold asked casually, nodding toward the worker. "Why is he still on the floor with an injury like that?" Ross scoffed, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. "He's clumsy," Ross replied as though it was obvious. "Keeps messing up, but he begged me to let him stay on. Generous, right?" His words sounded rehearsed, but Harold didn't buy it. The story wasn't adding up. Harold studied Ross for a moment, then turned his gaze back to the waiter. He had seen enough. The waiter's injury wasn't the only thing that needed attention. Harold knew there was a much bigger issue at play. As the evening shift began and customers filtered out, Harold stayed behind, his coffee now cold in front of him. He watched the waiter clean tables, his movements slow but steady. There was something about him, something that made Harold certain he was missing a key piece of the puzzle. The more Harold watched, the more he noticed patterns he hadn't seen before. It wasn't just the manager's harsh words. The waiter moved like someone who had been broken down, someone who feared making a mistake. Finally, Harold couldn't stay silent anymore. He had seen enough to know that something wasn't right here. He made up his mind that tomorrow he would return and dig deeper, get to the bottom of this strange situation. When Harold returned the next day, his determination was clear. He ordered the same coffee, sat in the same booth, but this time, he wasn't just a passive observer. He was going to uncover the truth. He kept his eyes fixed on Ross and the waiter. The tension was thick, and Harold could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about a bad day at work, it was something darker. Ross, ever the showman, continued to walk the floor like a king. But Harold noticed the subtle moments, the way Ross would sneer when the waiter made a minor mistake, the way he seemed to enjoy belittling him. Harold clenched his fist around his coffee cup. This wasn't just a manager being tough on an employee. This was something far more sinister, and he was about to find out exactly what. The morning was quieter than usual, the hum of conversation replaced by the clatter of plates and the soft scrape of chairs. The waiter moved with precision, though his hand remained stiff, reluctant. Ross was already at his post, eyes scanning the room, looking for any opportunity to criticize. His gaze fell on the waiter, who was carrying a tray of food with a grimace. The tension was immediate. "Move it! Hurry up!" Ross barked, his voice cutting through the quiet space. The waiter flinched at the harsh words, but didn't reply. He simply carried the tray, pushing through the pain that was becoming harder to ignore. The customers noticed, of course. A few exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with how the manager was treating the waiter. They saw the way he winced with every step, yet still tried to keep up with the pace. One woman, sitting near the window, leaned over to her companion and whispered, "He shouldn't be working like that. It's obvious he's hurt." The other woman nodded in agreement but said nothing. What could they do? In the back, Harold sipped his coffee, his eyes never leaving the waiter. He could see the strain in his movements, the stiffness in his shoulders. There was no way that hand was just a minor injury. Something deeper was at play. The waiter dropped a plate as he moved too quickly, the crash reverberating through the diner. Ross was on him in an instant, his words venomous. "Unbelievable. How many times do I have to tell you to be careful?" Harold watched closely. The waiter's face flushed with embarrassment, his good hand shaking slightly as he bent to clean the mess. Ross was relentless, taking every opportunity to belittle him. Something wasn't adding up. When the waiter finally stood, his eyes briefly met Harold's, and for a split second, there was a silent understanding. The pain in his eyes spoke volumes. Harold could see it now. This wasn't just an injury. This was a system of abuse. Another customer, a man at the counter, leaned forward and whispered to his companion, "That manager is really tough on him." I've never seen him act like this with anyone else." His voice was low, but the discomfort was obvious. Harold knew he couldn't let this go on. He had seen enough of the waiter's struggles to know this wasn't a case of clumsiness. There was something darker at play, and he intended to find out what it was. Later, when the lunch rush had settled, Harold quietly made his way to the back of the diner. He needed to see things for himself, hear things that the manager thought were safely out of earshot. What he would discover would change everything. Ross was in his office. The door cracked open just enough for Harold to hear the muffled sounds of conversation. He leaned closer, straining to catch the words. What he heard sent a chill down his spine. "I don't care if he's injured. He'll work until I say he's done. You think I'm running a charity?" Ross's voice was sharp, filled with an anger that had been barely contained. Harold's instincts told him this was only the tip of the iceberg. Harold stepped back, his heart racing. The anger in Ross's voice wasn't just frustration, it was something darker, and it seemed that the waiter's injury wasn't an accident. There was a story here, and Harold was going to uncover it. A few moments later, Ross emerged from the office, his usual smug grin plastered across his face. He was confident, maybe too confident. He had no idea that Harold had just overheard everything. The truth was out there. Harold's mind was racing. He needed more information, more evidence. But what he had just overheard was enough to convince him that Ross had a lot to hide. The question now was, how far did this go? As the evening crowd began to trickle in, Harold kept his eyes on the waiter. The pain was clear in his movements, but he never faltered. He kept his head down, focused on the task at hand, avoiding any further confrontation with Ross. Harold was about to make his move. He had seen enough to know that things were about to escalate, but he needed the proof. The truth had a way of hiding in plain sight, and he was determined to find it. The next morning, Harold returned to the diner, his resolve stronger than ever. He sat in his usual corner, watching as Ross barked orders and the waiter moved silently between tables, his hand still wrapped in bandages, the weight of his pain obvious. The diner was quieter than usual, the early morning calm before the rush. Harold sat in his corner booth, his eyes trained on Ross and the waiter. Today, he was determined to see more. The waiter moved carefully, balancing plates with his good hand. His wrapped hand remained stiff at his side, barely able to hold anything. Every time he reached for something with his injured hand, a flash of pain crossed his face. Ross, as always, kept a tight grip on the floor. He was at the register, barking orders, his voice cutting through the calm. When the waiter moved too slowly, Ross was quick to criticize. The cycle repeated. Harold watched the way Ross's gaze followed the waiter's every move, almost predatory in nature. It was as if Ross was just waiting for the moment when the waiter would make a mistake, a moment he could exploit. When the waiter returned with an empty tray, Ross snapped at him. "You should have had that done 10 minutes ago. How many times do I have to say it? Pick up the pace." His tone was harsh, cruel even. Harold frowned, his gaze not leaving the scene unfolding before him. He had seen enough managers in his life, but none quite like Ross. The way he targeted the waiter seemed personal, like he enjoyed it. The diner's hum of conversation filled the air, but Harold was focused entirely on Ross. He could feel his blood beginning to simmer. It was clear now. This wasn't just about managing a staff. There was something much darker at play. Harold took a slow sip of his coffee, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what had led to this animosity between Ross and the waiter, but it was more than just bad management. It was deliberate cruelty. The waiter, despite the abuse, continued to work. He carried the trays, filled the cups, cleaned the tables. His face was a mask of professionalism, but Harold could see the weariness in his eyes. This wasn't normal. A customer at the counter looked up from his menu and whispered to his friend, "Have you noticed how Ross treats that guy? He's awful." The friend nodded, glancing at the waiter before turning back to the conversation. The waiter's face flushed with embarrassment as Ross shouted another order, but he didn't respond. He simply nodded and continued working. His determination was admirable, but Harold knew it wouldn't be enough. This wasn't just about work anymore. As the rush began, Harold kept his distance, carefully observing every interaction between the waiter and Ross. Each exchange painted a clearer picture of a toxic dynamic. Ross wasn't just a manager, he was a bully, and the waiter was his target. Around noon, the diner was bustling with activity. Harold had been here for hours, observing the same patterns. The waiter's movements were slow, deliberate, as if each task was an obstacle. Harold couldn't help but feel for him. The tension in the air was palpable. Harold could see it in the waiter's eyes every time Ross approached. The unease, the fear of making the wrong move, it was almost suffocating. Harold's suspicion deepened. This wasn't normal workplace stress. It wasn't just the way Ross spoke to the waiter. It was the way he looked at him. There was a coldness in his eyes, an edge to his voice that made Harold's blood run cold. Ross wasn't just criticizing, he was belittling. Harold finally made his decision. He needed more information. He couldn't just sit back and watch this unfold. He had to get closer to the truth, and to do that, he needed to confront Ross directly. The diner was filled with the familiar morning rush, the clatter of silverware and the hum of conversation. But today, the air felt thicker, charged with the unspoken tension between Ross and the waiter. Harold sat quietly at his booth, eyes fixed on Ross as he stormed past the tables. His usually jovial demeanor was gone, replaced by something darker. There was no mistaking it now. Ross enjoyed controlling the atmosphere. The waiter moved around the diner, his injured hand still carefully held at his side. Harold noticed the subtle winces each time he reached too far or tried to carry something heavy with his good arm. The pain was constant. Ross, meanwhile, was on the attack. Every mistake, every slight delay, no matter how small, was met with Ross's biting remarks. The waiter, it seemed, had no room for error, and Ross wasn't interested in showing mercy. At one point, the waiter reached for a full coffee pot with his bad hand. It slipped, spilling a little. Ross was immediately there, his voice harsh and cutting. "Unbelievable! You can't even carry a coffee pot properly." The customers around them shifted uncomfortably, exchanging uneasy glances. Harold saw the hurt in the waiter's eyes, the desperation to make it through the day without giving Ross another reason to tear him down. Harold had seen managers before, but none with the cruelty Ross displayed. It wasn't just about work. It was personal. Ross wasn't trying to run the diner efficiently. He was breaking the waiter down, piece by piece. The waiter muttered an apology, his face flushed with embarrassment, but Ross didn't let up. "You should be more careful," he sneered, "but then again, I don't expect much from someone like you." The insult was sharp, deliberate. Harold clenched his fists under the table. He could see the way Ross's words cut deeper than the waiter let on. This wasn't just poor management. It was an abuse of power, plain and simple. Harold knew he had to intervene. Later, as the crowd thinned, Harold stood up and casually walked toward the counter. Ross was preoccupied, chatting with another employee. Harold took the opportunity to approach the waiter, who was wiping down a table near the back. "Hey, you doing okay?" Harold asked, his tone casual but concerned. The waiter looked up, startled, but quickly masked his surprise with a polite smile. "Yeah, just another day," he replied, his voice flat. Harold could see through the facade. There was no "just another day" for someone in his position. The injury, the constant pressure from Ross, and the sense of being trapped, it was wearing on him. Harold could see the fatigue in his eyes. "I've been watching you," Harold continued. "You're working hard, but there's something going on here. You don't have to pretend like it's nothing." The waiter paused, then lowered his gaze. He wasn't sure how much to trust this stranger. "I'm fine," the waiter finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. It's just, it's just how it is here." The words were almost a whisper. Harold could tell there was more to the story, but the waiter wasn't ready to share it yet. Harold nodded, sensing the hesitation. He decided not to press any further for now. Instead, he simply said, "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. You're not invisible, all right?" The waiter gave him a tight, grateful smile. As Harold walked back to his booth, his mind raced. The waiter was clearly in pain, emotionally and physically. He couldn't ignore what he had witnessed. He needed to know more about the history between Ross and the waiter. The night continued on, and Harold remained alert. He watched the interactions between Ross and the waiter closely, noting the subtle ways in which Ross would dismiss him or make him feel small. It was disturbing to watch. Ross's behavior was becoming clearer with each passing hour. It wasn't just that he was a bad manager. He was actively trying to break the waiter down to make him feel insignificant. It was a power play, pure and simple. Harold wasn't sure when or how things had gotten this bad between them, but he was certain of one thing. Ross was hiding something. And the waiter? He was a victim in a game that had gone on far too long. The morning light filtered through the windows, casting a soft glow on the diner. As usual, the bustle of customers filled the space, but today, Harold was more focused than ever. He had to get answers. The waiter, despite his injury, moved quickly, his face a mask of professionalism. But Harold saw the strain in his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand. Every step seemed to bring him closer to collapse. Ross, as expected, kept a tight grip on the diner, barking orders at the staff. He seemed more impatient today, more agitated. His eyes flicked toward the waiter, then quickly away. There was something in his demeanor. Harold could sense it. Ross was hiding something, and the waiter was the key. He needed to get closer, find a way to dig deeper into this mystery. But the diner was a small, tight-knit world, and any misstep could raise suspicions. As the waiter passed by, Harold caught his eye. There was a flicker of recognition before the waiter quickly looked away, his face flushing. It was clear that he was still afraid of what Ross might do if he spoke up. Harold's suspicion grew stronger. This wasn't just about poor management or an injured worker. It was about a hidden truth, something much darker than anyone realized. And it was clear that the waiter knew more than he let on. Later, when the lunch rush died down, Harold made his move. He slipped into the back office under the pretense of looking for the restroom. He knew the office door was often left unlocked, and now was his chance. The room smelled of paper and old coffee, the desk cluttered with paperwork. Harold quickly scanned the papers scattered across the desk, his eyes landing on a stack of employee records. His heart sank when he saw the waiter's name. There were several misconduct reports, each one detailing small mistakes. Spilled drinks, late orders, minor missteps. But what caught Harold's attention was the pattern. Every report had the waiter's name on it, but none of the other staff members had similar complaints. Harold's suspicion deepened. This wasn't just incompetence. It felt like a setup. Someone was using these reports to build a case against the waiter, to make him look like the problem. But who? As Harold continued to sift through the papers, he found something far more troubling: cash register discrepancies. Every week the numbers were off, but there were no reports filed about the missing money. It was clear that someone was skimming. The realization hit Harold like a punch to the gut. Ross wasn't just a cruel manager, he was stealing from the diner, and he was using the waiter as a scapegoat, hoping no one would connect the dots. Harold's blood boiled. He couldn't let this continue. The waiter had been set up, manipulated, and pushed to the brink. Ross was using him as a pawn in his own twisted game, and Harold wasn't going to stand for it. He left the office quietly, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just uncovered. Ross's theft was one thing, but the way he had targeted the waiter, that was a level of cruelty Harold couldn't ignore. As Harold returned to his booth, he glanced at the waiter, who was now quietly cleaning a table. He saw the weariness in his movements, the exhaustion that seemed to weigh him down. This man had been pushed far too long. Harold knew what he had to do. It was time to confront Ross, but he couldn't do it recklessly. He needed to be strategic. If he wanted to expose the truth, he had to do it without tipping Ross off. The lunch rush had passed, and the diner was quiet once again. Harold sat back, his mind working over the details. He had seen enough, but there was still more to uncover. The truth was within reach. The diner was quiet now, the clinking of plates and cups replaced by the soft hum of a few lingering customers. Harold sat in his booth, his eyes fixed on Ross, who was still busy at the counter. The weight of what Harold had uncovered was heavy on his shoulders. Ross had been stealing from the register, and he'd been using the waiter as a scapegoat. This couldn't go on any longer. The waiter moved through the diner, his injured hand still carefully held against his side. He seemed focused on his tasks, avoiding eye contact with Ross whenever possible. It was clear the atmosphere was unbearable. Harold knew that if he was going to expose Ross, he needed concrete proof. The stolen money was one thing, but the fabricated misconduct reports were the key. Those were the smoking gun that could take Ross down. As the shift progressed, Harold observed the way Ross interacted with the staff. It was subtle but manipulative. He would belittle the waiter in front of the others, make cruel remarks under his breath when he thought no one was listening. It was becoming clear to Harold that Ross wasn't just a manager, he was a bully, a man who found satisfaction in breaking people down, and the waiter had been his target for far too long. Harold needed to make sure the waiter knew he wasn't alone in this. He couldn't just sit back and watch him continue to suffer under Ross's control. It was time to intervene, quietly, strategically. Later, after most of the customers had left, Harold approached the waiter. He caught his attention with a simple nod, signaling for him to come over. The waiter hesitated but eventually walked over, a cautious look in his eyes. "I've seen what's been going on," Harold said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "You're not invisible. You're working harder than anyone else here, and you're being taken advantage of. It's time to stand up for yourself." The waiter froze, his eyes wide with surprise. "I don't know what you mean," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Harold could see the fear in his eyes, the fear of losing his job, of rocking the boat. Harold gave him a reassuring smile. "You don't have to face this alone. I know what Ross is doing. I've seen the reports. He's setting you up to take the fall. It's not your fault, and I'm going to help you." The waiter's shoulders sagged, and for a moment, Harold could see the relief in his eyes. "I didn't know who to turn to," the waiter admitted. "I've tried to keep my head down, but it's getting worse. Every day is harder." Harold nodded. "You don't have to keep taking this. You deserve better. We'll make sure Ross doesn't get away with this. But we have to act fast. He won't go down without a fight." The waiter swallowed hard, nodding. "What do I do?" "You keep doing your job, just like you've been doing. Let me take care of the rest. I'll expose what's been happening here, and you won't be blamed for any of it." Harold's voice was firm with conviction. Harold knew this wasn't going to be easy. Ross was ruthless, and he had been getting away with his manipulation for far too long. But Harold was determined to put an end to it. The waiter had suffered enough. He spent the next few hours carefully documenting everything he had seen: Ross's mistreatment, the stolen money, and the false reports. With everything in place, Harold knew it was time to take action. He waited until closing time, when the diner was empty and the staff had finished cleaning up. As Ross retreated to his office, Harold slipped into the back, his mind focused on one goal: exposing the truth. Harold found what he needed quickly: the folder with all the financial discrepancies, the forged misconduct reports, and the paper trail that connected Ross to the theft. He wasn't just going to stop at the manager's behavior. This would bring him down. He gathered the evidence carefully, making sure everything was in order. Once everything was packed into a folder, Harold made his way toward the back office, where Ross was presumably winding down after his shift. The diner was quiet, save for the occasional clink of silverware as the last few customers filtered out. Harold sat in his usual booth, his eyes fixed on the office door. Tonight, everything would change. He had the evidence now, proof of Ross's theft and cruelty. But Harold knew that simply confronting Ross wouldn't be enough. He needed to do it in a way that couldn't be denied, that would expose him for good. As he waited, Harold's thoughts raced. He could already feel the tension in his chest. This was a moment he'd been preparing for, but it was still daunting. Confronting someone like Ross wasn't easy. The door to the office opened, and Ross stepped out, still wearing his usual smug expression. He was finishing a call on his phone, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Harold stood, moving quietly toward him. Ross hung up the phone, catching sight of Harold approaching. His expression flickered for a second, but he quickly masked it with a grin. "Back for more eggs?" Ross chuckled, not taking Harold's presence seriously. "No," Harold said, his voice calm but firm. "Actually, I think it's time you and I have a conversation. I've been watching you, Ross. I know what you've been doing here, and it's over." Ross's smile faltered, just slightly. He looked around quickly, but the diner was empty. "What are you talking about?" he asked, trying to sound casual, though his voice lacked conviction now. Harold didn't hesitate. "I have all the proof. The stolen money, the forged misconduct reports, the way you've treated the staff, and most importantly, how you've used the waiter as a scapegoat to cover up your own actions." Ross stiffened. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a flicker of panic in his eyes. He tried to recover, laughing nervously. "You've got nothing. What are you, some kind of vigilante?" "No, I'm not a vigilante," Harold said, his voice steady. "I'm the owner of this diner, and I've been watching you for weeks. I know exactly what you've been doing to the waiter, and I won't let it continue." Ross's face drained of color as he realized what was happening. He opened his mouth to speak, but Harold wasn't finished. He pulled out the folder containing all the evidence, financial records, employee reports, everything. "This is your life on paper," Harold said, placing the folder on the counter. "You thought you could hide your theft, your abuse of power, but it's all right here, and it's going to the authorities if you don't start talking." Ross stared at the folder, his mind clearly racing. His jaw clenched, and he took a step back as if trying to gather his composure. "You can't do this. You don't know who you're dealing with," he muttered. "I think I do," Harold replied, his voice cold. "You're a coward, hiding behind your position, trying to break people down. But you're not going to get away with it. Not this time." For a moment there was silence between them. The weight of the situation settled over the diner like a heavy fog. Ross glanced at the door, but he knew there was no way out. He was trapped. Harold continued, "You can either walk away and face the consequences, or I can make sure the whole world knows what you've been doing. The choice is yours." His voice was unwavering, the power of the truth behind his words undeniable. Ross's eyes flickered, torn between defiance and fear. Finally he spoke, his voice low. "You don't know what you're messing with. I'll ruin you. Just like I ruined him," he spat, referring to the waiter. Harold's expression hardened. "No, Ross, you've ruined yourself, and you've ruined the trust of everyone who worked for you. This is over." The door opened, and the waiter walked in, looking surprised to see them both standing near the counter. He had been finishing his shift, and his eyes widened as he saw the tension in the air. "Is everything okay?" the waiter asked cautiously, his voice shaky. Harold turned to him and gave him a reassuring smile. "Yes, it's more than okay. This is the moment you've been waiting for." The waiter's eyes darted between Harold and Ross. He could see the anger on Ross's face, the panic in his eyes. It was clear that Harold had just cornered him, and there was no way out. "I've seen enough," Harold said, turning to the waiter. "It's time for you to step up and take control of your future. No more hiding, no more fear. You've been stronger than you know." The waiter looked at him, a hesitant smile forming. Ross stood there, fuming, his fists clenched at his sides. "You won't get away with this," he muttered. But Harold didn't flinch. He was done with Ross's threats. This was about justice, not intimidation. The diner was still, the tension hanging thick in the air as Harold turned to the waiter. The confrontation with Ross had reached its peak, but now it was time for everything to come to light. The waiter, still processing everything, slowly walked to the counter. He glanced at Ross, whose face was red with anger and embarrassment. The truth was finally out, and there was no escaping it. Harold looked at the waiter with a nod of approval. "It's time for you to have the respect you deserve. You've worked hard, and you've endured more than anyone should. Now, it's your turn." The waiter swallowed hard, his hands trembling, but his expression was resolute. He had been fighting this battle alone for far too long. Today things would change, and it felt like a weight lifting off his shoulders. Ross stood motionless, his eyes narrowing. "You'll regret this," he hissed through clenched teeth, but there was no fire left in his words. He was backed into a corner, and he knew it. Harold didn't respond to Ross. Instead, he turned to the waiter. "From now on, you're not just a worker here. You're a valued part of this place. I'm putting you in charge of the floor. You deserve it." The waiter's eyes widened in disbelief, his breath catching in his throat. "You mean it?" he asked softly, as if afraid to believe it. "After everything?" "Especially after everything," Harold replied, his tone firm. "You've earned this position, and I'm not letting anyone take that from you. Not anymore." For the first time in what felt like forever, the waiter's expression softened. His shoulders relaxed, and a small, genuine smile tugged at the corners of his lips. It was a smile of relief, of freedom. Ross, unable to hide his fury, stepped forward. "You think you can just come in here and take control?" he spat. "I'll have you fired in an instant. No one will believe you over me." Harold remained calm. "You're finished, Ross. I have everything I need to make sure you won't get away with this. You're done here. We're calling the authorities. The truth is out." The realization hit Ross like a freight train. His bravado crumbled, and his face drained of color. "You can't. You won't. This isn't over," he muttered weakly, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually," Harold said, "it is. It's over for you. You thought you could manipulate everyone, but it ends tonight. You're going to face the consequences of your actions." He nodded toward the back office. The waiter watched as Ross's shoulders slumped, the fight gone from him. For the first time, the power dynamic had shifted. The waiter wasn't just a victim anymore. He was a survivor, taking back control. Harold turned to the staff members who had gathered to watch the confrontation. "This is the way things are going to be from now on," he said. "No one here will be mistreated again. You all deserve respect." The staff murmured in agreement, their eyes filled with a mixture of relief and admiration for Harold. They had watched him stand up for the waiter, and now they saw the justice they had longed for. Ross, now visibly shaking, had no words left. He realized that the world he had controlled was slipping away from him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The truth had come out, and he was powerless. Harold stepped toward the door, turning to the waiter one last time. "You've earned this," he said quietly. "From now on, this is your place too. Don't ever forget that." The waiter nodded, his eyes shining with gratitude. For the first time, he felt like he belonged. It wasn't just the position, it was the acknowledgement of his worth, the validation he had long been denied. As Ross was led out by the authorities, the staff exchanged smiles. The weight of the oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a sense of unity and empowerment. Harold had done what needed to be done, and he had done it with integrity. Harold walked out of the diner, his steps steady and sure. The night air felt different, lighter. Justice had been served, and the quiet strength of the waiter had been recognized. Harold knew he had done the right thing. Inside, the diner was a place of possibility again. The staff had seen what it meant to stand up for each other, to fight against injustice, and to make sure no one would ever feel invisible again. As the door closed behind him, Harold couldn't help but smile. The diner would never be the same, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like the world had tilted in the right direction.